let me introduce our guest this evening. Dave Tomlinson is a Church of England priest. He's an author. I have multiple of his books here. I have more of books of his as well, and I've realised that I must have lent them to people because I can't find them. So I have various of Dave's books. Dave's a speaker at various festivals, I know, across the country, including Greenbelt, and also a regular contributor on Radio 2's Pause for Thought with, I think I heard at last estimate, up to a couple of million people listen to The Breakfast Show. So that's quite an audience on Radio 2 on the times where Dave is on. So I wonder if we might be able to get Dave on screen with me. Hi Dave, thanks for joining.
Hi there.
Hi, good. Can you hear us all okay? Is that all?
Yeah, it's all good. It's all good.
Wonderful. So my experience of meeting Dave, he won't remember this, but was, I think, just over 20 years ago-ish, something called Holy Joe's, which Dave started, which I might ask you about in a bit, when I was working in the East End of London, not too far from where Dave is based. Where are you joining us from today, Dave?
I'm in Somerset now, actually.
Somerset? Oh, not so far from us.
No.
And I remember one of Dave's books called Post Evangelical coming out, which was particularly relevant to me at that period of time where I was kind of asking lots of questions about my faith. We've done a few of these conversations over the years. I think the first one was 7 or 8 years ago in Alderholt, and we've got a few people joining us from there. I remember the first one of these we did at a community cafe that I was kind of heading up at the point, and one of the local churches sent down the theology police with leather-bound Bibles to check that it was all legit. I'm not sure it was, but that's sort of one of my memories of that evening, just as we're about to start, of various people walking through the door.
We got away alive anyway.
Yeah, I was going to say, I think we did another one after that. I think it was all right. I'm not sure they came, but we've had a few of these conversations. So I'll ask you about various things, Dave, if that's all right, and let's sort of see where we go. I've invited Dave because I think he's a really interesting figure and had lots of experience doing lots of different things. But like I say, the first thing I encountered you was Holy Joe's back some time ago now. Just tell everyone a little bit about Holy Joe's, what it was and how it formed and the story behind that.
So Holy Joe's lasted for 10 years, basically through the decade of the 90s. It came really after my career, if you like, as a leader in the house church movement came to an end, which was round about the end of the 1980s. For 20 years and more, you know, I'd been a national leader in the new kind of house church movement, and I jumped ship on all of that and really didn't know where I belonged. If you had said at the time the Church of England, I'd have probably thought you'd lost your marbles, but there it is. But in the kind of interim, really, or in that vacuum, I was surrounded by people, some of them are kids and their age, actually, who were kind of in their mid-teens, but others as well, who were going through various levels of kind of crisis of faith, if you like, you know, who had more questions than they could comfortably deal with. And we created Holy Joe's. To begin with, actually, it was in our living room, and then it went into the cellar of some offices that we had at the time in Brixton. And then quite quickly, it outgrew all of that, and we ended up in a pub at Clapham Common. Well, actually, over the 10 years, we were in, I don't know, about half a dozen pubs, really. It was a pub crawl, really, that lasted 10 years. And it was basically just creating a space where people could be authentic, where they could be honest, where they could ask whatever they wanted. There were no kind of theological police or thought police there. There were no right answers at the end of the evening. You know, I kind of hosted it and held it and guided it, and also, I suppose, resourced it with kind of theological kind of ideas and so on that kind of fed it along but fundamentally it was a place for what I would call a kind of grown-up approach to religion, where no one was telling you what you were supposed to believe or giving you the right answer. And over those 10 years, and we used a sort of, a kind of function room in these pubs. And basically people could behave just as they would in a pub, really, so whenever anybody wants to go and get another pint, they went off and got that. At that time people could smoke in pubs, so if they smoked, they smoked. And they could use whatever language they wished, and some of them did. But I think that for a lot of people it was a sort of last throw of the dice for whether they could find a way to approach faith that they could believe in, and I think through those 10 years, I would guess it was definitely, into the sort of four figures of people who came to Holy Joe's. Never more than 50 on a given night, because there's no more room in the pub for that, and usually it started with me giving a sort of 5-minute sort of spiel or something to set a conversation going, and then it was a sort of open free-for-all, and my job was to, as I say, to hold it. And what that meant actually was keeping some people quiet, shutting them up. Some people, when you give them the chance, will just kind of go at it non-stop, and making room for others who maybe were a bit more shy to have a say. I think that for a lot of people, it was a stopping off place. It was somewhere where they could begin to find out whether faith was something that they could still continue to journey. And in fact, as time went on, people with no faith came, people who were just exploring anything, And so, I think that probably there were some people for whom it was the last chance and they went away. But I think most people found it as a stepping stone back into a faith community. And I think over those 10 years, there were at least 6 or 7 people who actually went on to become ordained, mainly in the Church of England, including me, by the way, So, I think that's a bit of a picture, really.
Like I say, at that point, you weren't ordained in the Church of England.
No.
I guess we sort of share some kind of similarity of having an interest or affinity to people who are on the edge, or those who have been hurt by the church in some way. I just wonder how you were able to hold that when you became a parish priest at St Luke's. How you kind of found that transition of you could kind of be on the side doing the Holy Joe's thing, but kind of going up into the establishment of it. How did you kind of create a space that people still felt able to gravitate and to ask those really honest questions?
I mean, really, I suppose for the last 30 years, that's where my focus has been. People who are either hanging on by their fingernails, to faith or to the church, or increasingly as people are on the outside, and, over those years, I have had more people than I could possibly shake a stick at who've come to have a private conversation with me. Actually, a hell of a lot of clergy have come to see me before I was ordained and since, who wanted to have a conversation they couldn't have in their own church, to talk about their doubts, to talk about their own crisis of faith. And it was a bit like sort of Nicodemus, coming under the kind of the darkness of anonymity to have a conversation. And people would ring and say, can I take you for a pint, or can I take you for lunch? Or we walked on Clapham Common or Hampstead Heath, and had those kind of conversations that for some of them, I suppose they felt were potentially career-ending questions, had they talked about them more openly with their congregations or with their bishop or whoever. So that's really been my focus. The interesting thing about becoming a parish priest in North London, I suppose really what surprised me most of all about becoming part of the Church of England and becoming a priest in the Church of England was that I had thought that this whole notion of a parish was just a kind of, a hangover from a bygone era, an archaism. And I think what I found out was it became probably one of the most important things to me, that the Church of England does have this incredible kind of inroad to people's lives. It is the default church, isn't it, where people go if they want to have a religious wedding or a funeral or whatever. But also in so many ways, you just get an access to people's lives. And I thought that my real role was to be the vicar, you know, the pastor to this lovely congregation of people. And I was, but I found the more interesting, exciting part of it was being a priest to a parish and having this amazing inroad. So in some ways, as I say, whereas my sort of focus had been a lot on people who were just inside the church, hanging on for dear, like, you know, for dear life, I then found that my work as a parish priest took me to people who were outside, perhaps particularly people who were not far outside, you know, who were on some kind of spiritual journey or had some kind of spiritual aspirations, but wouldn't even dream of going to a church. So I think what I had was this amazing opportunity to smash their stereotypes about what a vicar was, and their stereotypes about Christianity and faith and so on. And so I think that what we did to the best of our ability was to create a parish church which was as accessible and welcoming and accommodating of people who were not religious. And in fact, by the time I left there, a very large percentage of the congregation were people who, you know, were not church-going people by nature, but had found this place where they could belong. And I think that, as I say, going along with the sort of ethos of the Church of England, where in principle you'd say everybody around here is part of this church, you know, and so my whole approach has always been include them in unless they say they don't want to be in, you know. And so I think that it was of no interest to me to try and convert people, to try and get them to, you know, believe these 6 impossible things before breakfast or whatever. It was to create a space where people could feel comfortable and have their journey that I could and we could help to resource and to encourage and affirm, but not telling them this is what you're supposed to believe. And so we had quite a lot of people coming along, just as we did latterly at Holy Joe's. And in a way, I think St. Luke's was, for me, Holy Joe's in a building with a spike on top, you know. And I think we had lots of people who, well, some people who would say they probably could. I mean, I do know a couple of people who'd say they were atheists, but were a part of this church because they found a deeper sense of bonding that wasn't demanding that you have to believe these things. And for lots of people, it was a way to find a journey into faith. So, yeah.
Just to pick up on that, how do you think you create that kind of environment that allows people to feel comfortable and free to express themselves?
Well, I think it,
a Sunday service context.
yeah, I think it is about being genuinely inclusive. And by genuinely, I mean not just sort of saying, oh, we really love to have you all here. You know, we can all do that. But underneath of it, that there are these kind of requirements, if you like, of people. And we maybe get soft on the way they're put across. But what I'm talking about is where there are no requirements other than the fact that, and this is, to me, it's modeled on Jesus in the Gospels, you know, who his so-called table fellowship was, you know, to be called a friend of sinners, to be part of, you know, a kind of table fellowship with people who were the unacceptables within the religious institution. And I think that it's trying to create that kind. So, you know, there are definite sort of problems to doing that if you require everyone to come into this building, because the building itself is a problem, you know, and all the kind of baggage that people bring of in terms of what they think this is about. And some of the things that we do are with the best will in the world. As much as you try to make this not a club, there are things which are more familiar to some people who are regulars, and so I think it's trying to minimize all of those, but also saying this isn't all about getting people into a service on Sunday. You know, it's about relationships, it's about a network. And you know, there are times when you know, I can't think of how many like funerals I've taken or been involved with people in their lives in all sorts of ways, where they've kind of rather apologetically said, I'm afraid I don't go to church very often, or I'm
Yeah,
not much of a believer. And
absolutely.
I say, do you know what? I don't think God cares whether you come to church or not. I do. I'm a vicar. I want you to come. But if I believed that God was the sort of being who judged people or categorized people in that way, even saying churchgoers, non-churchgoers, believers, not, I think that would likely turn me into an atheist in itself, because I would say that sort of God would be less sensible than me, because I can see that it's much more about what's going on in people's hearts and lives than whether they, kind of fulfill these sort of certain outward kind of requirements.
Sure.
So I think it's that, and actually part of that, because I've mentioned the table fellowship, um, you know, the way I instigated at St. Luke's was to have an all-inclusive approach to the Eucharist. I've for a long time really disliked this sort of idea that we've got something which is a celebration of grace, which is, unmerited favor, unconditional love, inclusion, generosity, which then says, but you can only sort of take part in it if you fulfill these requirements. So I know there are problems if you're a Church of England clergyman about this, or clergy person, but I just waded straight into this to say that I believe that Eucharistic theology has been too much based around the Last Supper, which would be perceived as being a kind of in-group, although that may not be quite right. And the Last Supper is part of it, but what about the First Supper? What about all the suppers that went before it? The table fellowship. So I think my Eucharistic theology is very much influenced by the table fellowship of Jesus, and therefore, I would say this is the table of Jesus Christ, where all are welcome and no one is turned away. Therefore, we offer bread and wine to every single person without exception. If you would like to receive, then you are welcome to do so. And to me, the basic sort of principle is if people put their hands out, I am going to put something into it.
Absolutely.
And, I have had interesting conversations with, bishops over the years about this, but, I've been quite unyielding that I think this to me is the gospel. I think that the Eucharist is the gospel. It's a place of invitation and welcome. And unfortunately, I think people get a little bit too kind of picky about it. So it's all these sort of ways of trying to, be as much as possible a place where people come in and immediately do not feel that they are categorized as sort of newcomers or outsiders or whatever.
Sure. I guess I've related this, talk about those who are in and out, those who are worthy, those who aren't worthy, all of those kind of things. I think Debbie's asked the question in the chat, but I'll do it now. I kind of promoted this a bit by saying there's an article written about you where you're referred to as the villain's vicar.
Right. Yeah.
Do you want to tell a bit about that story of how that sort of came about, of what it relates to?
Well, I think that, one of the things that I really enjoyed over the years in my role there in North London was a very, very good relationship with funeral directors. And of course, and so I had lots of kind of more confidential kind of conversations, I suppose, with funeral directors who would sometimes tell me their problems with clergy and the struggles that they had. And that's another whole conversation in itself. But I think that, I gained a reputation for being someone who, was perhaps more inclusive and welcoming than some, So they sometimes, pushed along to me some quite interesting gigs, really. One of which was that I took the funerals of two of the great train robbers, Ronnie Biggs, and before that, Bruce Reynolds, was reckoned to be the brains behind the great train robbery back in the 60s, and so I took his funeral basically because the church that he wanted to have his funeral in, the vicar refused to include all the things that his son wanted to have in the funeral, which I thought were all very reasonable, actually. His son's part of a rather successful band called Alabama 3, and they wanted to they did the theme tune to who is it, the big kind of Rogues Thing show, The Sopranos.
Oh, yeah.
And anyway, trying to cut a long story short, I ended up stepping in and taking this funeral, and I met Ronnie Biggs there, who was not in a good place at the time, physically, and I read out um, his tribute to his old friend. And so it was no surprise when, less than a year later he died, that his son came to me and asked if I would take his funeral. And I mean, Ronnie Biggs, I would say, was probably the one of the biggest gigs I've ever done, really. The paparazzi around Golders Green crematorium, I can't tell you. I mean, it stopped the traffic, and there was a very colorful bunch of people there. And going to the pub afterwards, where we had to have a pass to get in, because there were people they didn't want to be there, and the pass was you were given a piece of Monopoly money. this is how you got into the pub. And I had so many wonderful conversations with people who were, in many ways, quite a rogues gallery, really. So yeah, it was along those lines. Actually, Ronnie Biggs' granddaughter, I baptized her just a couple of weeks after I took his funeral. His son and daughter-in-law said, we've never had her baptized. Now we know who we would like to do it. So I baptized little Lily, and to a much smaller gathering. And but the cortege for Ronnie Biggs was led by about 20 Hell's Angels on their Harleys, and one of them came to the baptism. He was called Ian. He was about 7 foot tall, and had his jacket with his colors on and everything, and he'd become aware of the fact that after having quite a lot of publicity about doing Ronnie Biggs' funeral, I did get quite a bit of negative feedback from certain overzealous religious people who sort of said, that you're kind of taking the funeral of the, well, one person said, you're a disgrace to God, I mean, I don't know how you arrive at that conclusion when all you're doing is taking a funeral, but anyway, Big Ian said to me, he said, I've heard that you've been having threats, Dave, after taking Ronnie's funeral. So I said, well, no, not really threats. So he said, the boys weren't happy about that. So he said, if you have any trouble, you contact me. So I've always kind of held on to his card just in case, because you never know, do you? But I think my approach is that I think Jesus hung out with, the misfits and probably the rogues, really. And he admitted one of the thieves on the cross, didn't he? Well, I personally think both of them, but so I think that if we're not the villains, Vicar, then I don't know if we're really getting the message right at all.
Sure. One of the conversations I'm really interested in, I'm doing some writing around it at the moment, is what people refer to as the sort of the sacred versus secular kind of conversation of saying there's the part of life where we say, well, that's the God stuff, and then there's the other stuff, particularly in terms of music or poetry or story. I think what you've always done, and I've always been kind of influenced by, is how you have an approach that weaves those things together. So actually there isn't this sacred and secular divide, that God is as much involved in things that we might classify as secular as he is in sacred.
Yeah.
I wonder if you want to say something about that, and maybe how that played itself out within your church community.
Yeah, I don't think there's such a thing, you see, as religious truth and non-religious truth, or religious beauty and non-religious beauty. This is God's world, and I think that all truth is God's truth, all beauty is God's beauty, all love is God's love. However it's expressed, whatever language is used, whatever context it's in. So that the idea of splitting things, of carving the world up into a sort of sacred and secular, to me makes absolutely no sense at all. And that's aided by the fact that I have to say an awful lot of what has been called, things like Christian music historically, has been to me a lot less appealing than the so-called secular music. it's just a really a ridiculous kind of categorizing, I think. And it's interesting, going back to the Eucharist, there's a sort of offertory prayer, which sometimes only clergy know about these terminologies and everything. But when we bring the bread and the wine and place it on the table, then there's a prayer of offering these things to God. And the more Catholic sort of tradition has this prayer, which is something like, "Blessed are you, Lord God of all creation. Through your goodness, we have these gifts to offer, which earth has given and human hands have made. They will become for us the body and blood of Christ, and the cup of salvation," and so on. So the beauty of that prayer, and I love that prayer, is that what it's doing is it's affirming, first of all, the material universe, the material world, which earth has given, but it's also affirming human endeavor and human culture, which human hands have made. And it's the combination of these two things that then can mediate divine grace, So to me, that the Eucharist and that prayer go well beyond the sort of limits of the ritual of communion, in church. It's a statement of that, the way we view the whole of life, really, that nothing in the world to me is truly profane or secular. Everything potentially is sacramental. Everything can be a means of grace. So in practice, in church over those 20 years I was in North London, we would often incorporate, as well as having biblical readings, we may incorporate, poetry or a music video, or use a lot of art. I mean, we were very keen on art. There was lots of art around the church, but it wasn't necessarily visibly religious art, but things which, were evocative, things which touched us, which resonated. And so I think, as best we could, I tried to sort of meld these things in to work them together. And another good side of that, I think, is that it means that people are finding that they're being presented with and stimulated by and having a different interpretation of things that are part of their ordinary life out there, suddenly here in church, So it would be not uncommon to have sermons that were, based largely around I don't know, line of duty, let's say, something that would be thought of as being secular out there, but actually is part of the consciousness of people. And that's really, if you look at St. Paul in the book of Acts, it's interesting. Whenever Paul, if you can check this out, anybody can check it out. Whenever Paul was speaking to a Jewish audience, he quoted the Hebrew scriptures, what we call the Old Testament, and talked about Christ revealed in the Hebrew scriptures. It's interesting that when he talked to non-Jewish audiences, he never quoted the scriptures. And the classic, of course, is Acts 17, where he was at the Areopagus, in Athens on Mars Hill, where he didn't quote any scriptures at all. He talked about the unknown God, and that was interesting. He said that the God that you worship ignorantly, I am proclaiming to you. Wow. I mean, just take that statement alone is mind-blowing, really. And then, he quotes from a Greek poet, in him we live and move and have our being, was not a quote from the Old Testament. It was a quote from a Greek poet. And so that to me is very educational, that sometimes we've tried to shove scriptures down people's throats, people who have no connection with scripture. It just isn't their idiom, rather than recognizing the fact. Paul also talked about the world around, the God who made these things. And so to me, as I say, the whole world belongs to God, whether it's a Greek poet, or beautiful countryside, or a kind of Lily Allen song, or whatever, So yeah, we tried to weave them together.
You talked about, I'm going to feed in some other questions I see going through. Sorry, I'm changing the format slightly because I realised I can see the chat coming through. But you talked about taking Ronnie Biggs's funeral and various other, and as your biggest gig. I guess Pause for Thought's a pretty big gig in terms of the amount of people you're. How did that come about? And sort of tell us about how you might approach sort of speaking on in that format.
So Post Thoughts obviously is I think a little piece of genius that exists, and a lot of people may not know that there's actually there's actually three different Pause for Thoughts at different time slots. So there is one actually in the middle of the night, but most people might not know about that. There's one in the early show in the morning, which is I think Vanessa Redgrave still does. Vanessa Felt still does.
Yeah.
And then there's the sort of later one, which is now Zoe Ball. It was Chris Evans when I first started as it. And they've all got huge audiences, but I mean the breakfast show has got the biggest radio audience in Europe, I believe. And so what an opportunity. And so you tend to sort of start off in the middle of the night and gradually come forward. And I remember the very first time that I was asked to go on to the Chris Evans show. I mean, I was quite overawed. I mean, I've got enormous admiration for Chris Evans. And I came to have a lot more, actually. I came to see, to appreciate his real spiritual curiosity. And he's of all, I mean, don't tell Zoe Ball this, but of everybody, he's been my favorite person because he so kind of comes back and digs beneath the surface of what you've said. But basically, you have got, a 2 or 3 minute opportunity to say something which, needs to be at a Radio 2 level, and if anything, I probably have at times in my submitting my scripts erred toward Radio 4 a little bit too much, and my editor has nicely shoved me back to Radio 2. And I think I've come to find that Radio 2 probably is about the right level for me. It's fun. It's not too serious. It's not too kind of poker faced, and you've just got that opportunity, and it's a marvelous one, as people are taking their kids to school or they're having their breakfast or whatever. And over the years that I've been doing it, the most gratifying thing, is to have people track you down. They find your email, they find you on Facebook and come back. And I've had so many people. I remember a man comes to mind straight away who said he was in Hull, I think he was. And he said, I'm a long distance lorry driver and I've just listened to you. And he said, I've never been to church, and I've never had any interest in God at all. And I just want to say, I loved everything that you just said, and you think this guy bothered to stop his truck to find where I was and to send this message. And there's been loads and loads of responses like that. So yeah, it's not a place to preach at people, and who wants to do that? But it's also not a place where you have to shy away from talking about God or spirituality. There's no blocks on what you can talk about. But I think that, what came out most of all is that this is a time slot where there's a hell of a lot of people who are carrying a lot of stress. And I think if you can do something that just brings a little bit of peace to them, that points them in a more kind of contemplative direction in their life, that connects them to some deeper issues, well, that's pretty good, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm always blown away by people who are on it who manage to say something in such a short period of time. Various people here would wish I would say a short period of time, so I've tried my best. Just a reminder for anyone, please do put any questions or comments and stuff in the chat. I think there's a few coming through. Staying on Pause for Thought, who's the most famous person that you've met in amongst? Chris Evans is pretty famous.
Yeah,
who have you met that's been really good and fun during that process?
Pretty famous. I'll tell you this about Chris, that I was at somewhere up in Yorkshire, I think, at a market, and I saw a copy of his I think he's done a couple of autobiographical, and I picked up which was his latest one, in which they're very kind of piecemeal chapters that he writes, and there's this one which is the most inspirational people, and it's interesting. And then his list of inspirational people top of his list of inspirational people for him was Jesus.
Right.
And a lot of people might be shocked by that, but he's a very interesting person. So I don't know. I mean, obviously, going into the Radio One there, you kind of often are brushing into people who are there for doing interviews, musicians and people, celebrities. And the nice thing is, because they're on radio, often you don't even recognize them because they're not made up, they're kind of very, very ordinary looking people. I mean, one of the great things about St. Luke's was that, as a church, that we had a lot of connections there. And my colleague there, who became ordained while I was there as a sort of self-supporting minister, Martin Rowe, he worked as the editor of U2's website, and through that he's now become sort of a chaplain really to the band when they're on the road, which is because they're a village. There's about, I don't know, about 250 people traveling around, so through that, Bono and his family would quite regularly sort of suddenly turn up at church on a Sunday morning. You wouldn't know when they were coming, and I remember the first time when I looked up and I saw Bono and Edge, the two of them sitting there in front, looking like Bono and Edge, slightly unnerving. Actually, there's this one time when there was a guy who was coming to church. I mean, those of you clergy know what I mean here, who was coming to church really because he wanted his little boy to get into the church school, and I don't blame people for doing that. I would do that if it was me. But this guy was there, and so I was talking to him afterwards, and I said, "Did you see who was sitting behind you this morning?" So he said, "No." "Who?" So I said, "Bono." He said, "Nah." I said, "Yeah, look, there he is there." So he turned around, he said, "Oh, he does look like him, doesn't he?"
Excellent. Well, yeah, I can't compete with any stories as good as that. So, again, please do keep sending through your messages. Oh, let's take this one before we go on to something else. Debbie's asked, is there anyone who Dave wouldn't do a funeral for?
That's a very good question, actually. And in fact, it was one that did come up at the time when I did I mean, to me, you see, I think with the train robbers, I didn't even have the slightest question about these things, really. I mean, I think these are two men who've been on a long journey, and you could talk about the train robbery, actually. And I mean, I think that their sentences were massively overinflated for what they did. There was a whole kind of institutional kind of thing surrounding that, really. But then what would I think about sort of, I don't know, Brady, say, a sort of pedophile or the whatever. I don't think there is anyone, I can't think of anyone whose funeral I wouldn't take if I was asked to do so, especially by their loved ones, because taking someone's funeral isn't saying anything about how you feel about that person's life or the choices that they made in life. You may think they made appalling choices, but I think if we're going to be judged on that basis, I might worry about who'll take mine. That's not what it's about, is it? I think it's entrusting this person for all that they are into the hands of God, whose arms I believe are the arms of love and grace. So I don't think it's at all saying that I like everybody whose funeral I would take. That's not a requirement, is it? Or that I would approve of things that they did in their lives. That, again, it's not a requirement. So I think that what it is, it's an opportunity for the people who are living to demonstrate a loving, generous, gracious attitude from the Christian community, and I think that can in itself be life-changing for some people, so yeah, I wouldn't be an issue to me, really.
Well, moving on to talk about your books. You're quite a prolific writer. How many books have you written now?
I think it's 7. I've written parts of other books as well, you know, but 7 books that have bear my name.
Yes. Are you working on anything at the moment?
Do you know, I'd really like to. I thought that I was going to have bags of time through the lockdown.
Yeah.
And right at the very, very beginning, some friends said, "Oh, you got to do something for us, Dave." And so we came up with this idea of doing. I'm actually in my shed right now. I know it looks rather salubrious with the books and everything, but this is a shed at the bottom of our garden, and it's where I work. And so I said, "All right, I'll do something called the Holy Shed." So I've been doing these kind of shed casts really every week from here and more. And then I've, you know, been asked to do sermons in Vancouver and, you know, Lord knows where. So it's ended up being quite a busy time. But yeah, I think the book that I want to write, there's a chapter in the last book that I wrote, which is Black Sheep and Prodigals. There's a chapter in that book, which I never intended to have in it originally. It kind of came in the writing. It's a chapter which, I mean, all the chapters are called I Believe. It's kind of a book of my credo in a way, my rather heretical credo. And so they're all a bit tongue-in-cheek. And there's a chapter there which is called I Believe God is Human. It's the rest of us I'm not sure about. And this chapter was my way of kind of coming out, really, to say that I have no problem in saying that I am a humanist as well as a Christian. Now, lots of people think humanist just means atheist. Well, it doesn't, of course. Actually, humanism goes way back before. The roots of humanism are within the Christian community, but that's another thing. But I think that it's, I want to write about the humanity of God, really. And so that's a kind of important sort of thing that I'm toying around with. My problem is, you know, I've got a monkey mind, you know, so and I'm easily distracted, and I kind of start working on one thing, and then suddenly there's something else glistering over here. So there's at least a dozen books that I'd like to write, really. But I think, you know, all of everything I write and I want to write now is I want to write for an audience that stretches beyond the borders of faith and non-faith, really. I want to write in a way that is stimulating and helpful to people who identify as people of faith, but I never want to do it in a way that excludes or feels alien to people outside, because I think, you know, people are on real, genuine spiritual journeys, whether or not they go to church. And it's trying to connect to that. That's what really interests me a lot.
Yeah, one of your books, I think probably 2 or 3 ago, was called "How to Be a Bad Christian," which was beautifully provocatively titled. I thought, and I've got a copy of it here, and you've written in it. He said, "Be bad for God's sake." In the, I wonder if you wanted to just. Because I know there's at least a couple of people who have joined us today who have been reading that completely unprompted by me before any of they knew we were doing these. But tell us a bit about that book and the idea behind it.
That book was a bit of a sort of turning point for me, because, as I say, I think that up until that point, I had been writing mainly for what you might call struggling Christians, you know, people who are struggling with issues of faith. You know, I mean, in technical terms, my writings are basically apologetics. You know, I'm trying to express the Christian faith in a way that makes sense in the world of the 21st century. And up until then, that my main focus had been there. How to Be a Bad Christian was writing for my kind of parish audience, if you like, but knowing that people inside the church would also hopefully find it helpful too. So really, I was reading a book which I don't know, I think it may be somewhere around here on my desk. I was reading a book. I've always been interested in birds, big time birder, you know. And there's a book by Simon Barnes called How to Be a Bad Bird Watcher. And never seen a book called that before. Liked the idea of it, started reading it. He starts off by saying, "I'm a bad bird watcher," patently untrue. He's a very good bird watcher. He's the patron of the RSPB. And but what he's saying in the book is, you know, you look out of a window, you see a bird, you enjoy. Congratulations, you're a bad bird watcher. You think you don't know much about birds? Well, let's think about that. You know, a sparrow and a blackbird and a robin and a magpie, you know, so there's 10, to which we could add, you know, a pigeon and, you know, an owl and a sea, you know, so there's 20. So, you know, quite a lot. And this sort of immediately sprang, I thought, oh my goodness, I've got to write a book, because what he's doing is taking bird watching out of the hands of geeks and twitchers and people with expensive binoculars to say birds belong to everybody. And that's really what I think about God. And I think it's a really bad idea to leave birds in the hands of twitchers. I think it's also a very bad idea to leave God in the hands of religious people, because I think God is part of everybody's life, whether they know it or not. And so just as Simon Barnes is sort of writing a kind of tract for this thing that he's passionate about, I felt that's what I wanted to do, to try to jump over this divide and connect with people, to affirm their kind of experience of faith that they may not even think of as faith, you know. And so I was very, very pleased that, you know, it was the first of my books that really got strong presence in non-religious bookshops, and that's what I've wanted all along. And just has brought waves of responses from people, and an awful lot of them begin with something like, I'm not really religious, but, and that's exactly the response I think that I was looking for, to connect with those people who don't perceive of themselves as being at all religious, but once you begin to speak in language they can understand, they say, oh yeah, you know, I agree with that, I feel like that too.
Yeah.
So that's what I, and the whole title, of course, is How to Be a Bad Christian and a Better Human Being. And I think there are a lot of better human beings, to be honest with you, outside of the faith community than some of the ones that I find inside.
Okay, let's take a few questions that we've had through. I think we can take two of these together, actually. Jackie asks, this is a great question, what religion, spirituality do you think Jesus would be if he came now? And linked into that, Peter asks, do all faiths lead to the same God?
Okay, yeah, so I think what is vastly overlooked by Christians is that Jesus was a Jew. You know, now they say, oh yeah, of course he was, you know, but then they'd go on to think, but he's a Christian, really. No, Jesus was never a Christian. Christianity didn't even exist anyway. Jesus was a Jew from the day he was born to the day he died. I don't think that Jesus ever intended to invent something called Christianity. It's happened, and I am a Christian, and so I'm not kind of having a big fight about that, but I don't think that's what Jesus came to do. I think that Jesus came proclaiming what he called the kingdom of God, which is life, both individually and collectively, as God would wish it to be. So I think that he called people essentially back to the heart of their faith, which for him was the Jewish faith. And I think that's an important thing. I think the Jewishness of Jesus has been completely lost. We've baptized Jesus in Christianity to make someone who the Jesus of Nazareth wouldn't even begin to recognize the Jesus that we have turned him into today. Not least because we've made him westernized, you know, whereas Jesus was a Middle Eastern person. His whole culture and life and mentality was that. So I think that, you know, and interestingly, when people came to him from different faiths or, you know, shades of different faiths, he never, ever asked them to become Jews, much less Christians, of course, you know, whether that was the Samaritans, who were considered to be kind of, you know, religious bastards by the Jews. They were sort of a mixture. Or whether you look at the, you know, the sort of Canaanite woman, a Roman centurion, you know, people who came from, he never told them to become Jews or to change their religious faith. he called them to God, to the heart of God, to the kingdom of God, actually, as something, a reality in their lives. So he was pointing them back to that. So I think that I don't believe that Jesus would be hugely interested in religious denominations, I think that he would be interested in human beings, and he would be calling them to be the very, very best that they can be under God, as human beings, as people. Now we have all this range of different faiths, and I love them. I love. I mean, very briefly, my approach to different religious traditions is I view them as being like different linguistic systems. They're different languages with their own grammar and their own vocabulary, and my mother tongue is Christianity, but in a multilingual, religiously multilingual world, I think it behoves us to learn the languages of other faiths. And I've done that for years by sitting on interfaith panels. I spent 5 or 6 years latterly in my time at North London going to an interfaith panel where I sat and became very, very dear friends, with people of different faiths. We took the piss out of each other, we bantered, we argued, we disagreed, we saw things differently, but we were friends. And I think we would all look at each other and say, brother, sister, we are pilgrims on a journey. So do all religions lead to God, I think is not necessarily the right question. I think that people can find God in lots of different ways. And I think there are things about all the faiths, including Christianity, which I think are hindrances to people's journey of faith with really finding God. And I think there are things in all the faiths which are very helpful. And so I make no apologies for being a Christian, and I certainly make, more than anything else, I would label myself a follower of Jesus. Without Jesus, I don't think I would be a Christian. Well, that's a bit of an obvious thing, isn't it? But I think that to me, whenever I'm tempted, and I have been, to abandon ship on the church and so on, it's Jesus that reconverts me, that brings me back again and again and again. And so that's who I am, and I make no apologies for that, and I'm passionate about it. But at the same time, I recognize there are people who have come different journeys, were born in entirely different cultures, different religious cultures, or who have, got no affinity with Christianity, who nevertheless may well be on genuine sort of journeys that I can identify with and hopefully contribute to.
Sure. We're running out of time, but
sorry.
which is a shame. But I'll just read Jackie's comment, who asked the question before. She said, I had a Jewish boyfriend at college who was totally shocked when I told him Jesus was Jewish. So Christianity has done an epic PR number. I'm going to ask one of my own questions to sort of as we draw towards an end. And I wonder, after I've asked that one in a few minutes' time, I wonder if you might give us a bad Christian's blessing to, if you can make one up to finish. One of the things I'm really interested in, I make no apologies that I'm researching my MA dissertation during this interview, but you've written a book called Re-Enchanting Christianity, which is one of your older books, I think.
Yeah.
And I love that that phrase of re-enchanting Christianity. I wonder, just really briefly, what does that look like? What does a re-enchanted Christianity look like? Is the Church of England dead?
Oh, well, I think that, the idea of, I was originally going to call that book Second Innocence.
Okay.
Because, Paul Ricoeur, who's one of my great sort of mentors, as a writer, I studied hermeneutics, and that was his field. And, he talked about the fact that there's this sort of dialectic or movement that goes on. He talked about in relationship to a text, but you can think of it in all sorts of ways, that begins with a naive innocence. And I think lots of us start off the pathway of faith with this wide-eyed innocence that we're told all these lovely simple things, and we just drink it all in and we believe it and so on and so forth. And some people do carry on like that and never have any problems. But lots of us then go through the second movement in this tension towards disenchantment, or to a point of criticism where we begin to deconstruct faith, or it just unravels on us and we don't think it'll ever go back together again, And Ricoeur was saying there is the possibility of a second innocence, a point of re-enchantment, which can never go back to the first innocence. You can never recover that first innocence, nor would you wish to. It's childlike, it's childish, but it's kind of being able to bring together a kind of commitment to faith with all the doubts and questions as well, and not having to kind of completely resolve that, but living with both. So I think a re-enchanted Christianity to me is a faith that has discovered a renewed sense of passion for the core, for what it's all about, which for me is Jesus, but which never thinks that there is an answer to all the questions that are raised by this, So as Rilke, the poet, famously said, living the questions, don't try to find answers, he said, but live the questions, and one day perhaps you'll live into the answers, So I think that a re-enchanted faith to me is a faith that's living on that kind of edge, really, of not being sort of devoid of passion and fire and all of that, but at the same time holding on to the questions and the doubts, and not feeling that you have to completely resolve the two, really.
Thanks, Dave. Well, we are about out of time, which is a real shame. Thank you for joining us, and for everyone joining us. There's lots of questions and nice comments coming through. I just feel very encouraged and challenged about the way we as churches here become inclusive, as we provide spaces where people are free and feel comfortable to share their doubts and faith. And I guess we're on a journey wrestling with all of that over the coming years. Just to say, before we ask Dave to give us a bad Christian's blessing, before we go, over the next few weeks, next week we have Paul Carenza with us. Paul is a stand-up comedian, and he's a writer for the BBC series Miranda and Not Going Out and various other kind of big TV programmes. We're going to ask him a bit about his experience of his faith within that environment. He's another Pause for Thought contributor as well. The week after we have Harry Baker, who's wonderful poet, and would you believe he's one half of the world's foremost comedy rap jazz duo. Of all those ones that you know about, Harry will be really great, and that's 2 weeks' time. And then our final week, we've got Hilary Bont, who's joined us this evening, who's a priest in Wareham and a real activist when it comes to climate change and views around faith and the environment. And she's going to speak to us a bit about that, or I'm going to interview her a bit about that. So please do join us for those conversations as well. And as people get more confident, do leave your questions in chat. Various ones are coming through now, but we haven't got time for those at this stage. Dave, do you want to finish our evening by giving a blessing?
Can I just say that, I don't expect that. Thank you so much for having me here, and thank you each and every one of you for being present. I don't expect that everyone will agree with everything I say. I'm not even sure I do that. I'm thinking about these things all the time. I think that what is important isn't whether you believe in what this person says. I think the important thing is to be authentic, to be true to your own self, to your own heart, and to I think the voice of God in you. And I think that's something we need to be affirmed in much more. So when I say be a bad Christian, be bad for God's sake, I think it's about being true to yourself, and that is to be true to God, I think. So I don't know about bad Christian blessings, but this is the blessing that I always use, often here in the Holy Shed. So the blessing of God, the eternal goodwill of God, the shalom and salam of God, the wildness and warmth of God be among us and between us now and always. And the blessing of God, creator, liberator, and sustainer, be with us and remain with us always. Amen.
Amen. Thank you everyone for joining us. If you want to hear more of Dave, you've got his books, various ones here, and get them from your favourite online book supplier, or no, actually you're allowed to go to bookshops now, aren't you? So you can even get them in your favourite bookshops. And if you read them, do have conversations with me about what you're enjoying or what you're wrestling with. I'd be delighted to have a conversation with you.
Thank you for your comments.
So much, Dave. Thank you so much for what you shared with us tonight.
Lovely. Cheers.
Great pleasure. Thank you.
Great.
Do email me or message me, whatever, if you want. I love to hear back from people. So
great. Yeah, I can get you those details if anyone wants to chat with Dave.
Thanks very much, Lewis.
Thanks everyone. Cheers. Thanks, Joe, and thanks everyone. We'll see you next week. We'll hang up the call now, I think. All right. Thanks for joining us, everyone. Bye.
Bye.